This is Kathleen Smith here at ClearedJobs.Net, veteran-owned ClearedJobs.Net, and we're doing another Military Monday morning. Joining me is Bob Wheeler. Bob, remind us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so just a really quick thing, and this is going to kind of pertain to what we're going to talk about today. I was in the Navy for 20 years, and of those 20 years, 10 from 2001 to 2011 was all. I was in the Navy, but I spent most of my time with the Marine Corps. So for 10 straight years, I was in the Camp Lejeune area with the Marines from 01 to 11, and I was really in a bubble. I was in a military bubble for those 10 years. My last 3 years, I went up to Maryland, where I was recruiting doctors, and that was the part that really helped me break out of that military bubble, where I saw a lot of things that I was doing maybe incorrectly. So I retired in 2014. I've been with ClearedJobs.Net for the last 6 years now, but I'm still very connected to the military community.
Sounds great. Well, I was actually part of a chat over the weekend on Discord, and it was interesting. This topic came up of how do military folks change their speak and their writing into civilian speak, because it's very interesting that, especially now during the pandemic, we are relying a lot more on email communication, video chat, and also our resume. But a lot of times we've noticed that military personnel use standard military speak rather than civilian speak. So you want to talk a little bit about civilian speak?
Yeah, so when you're in the bubble, first of all, you get very used to using acronyms and terms and phrases and things like that that are very military centric. So that's one thing. If you stay in that bubble, you're not going to do as well in communicating. And then I think what we're going to talk about today, the way we're going to take this is the next step is a lot of times people go, oh my God, I'm in this bubble. I've got to change my speak. But it's not as simple as just plugging and playing with different words, because sometimes you can actually, show your, I don't want to say the word ignorance, but I think ignorance is the right word. If you start using these buzzwords and terms like in the wrong manner, because you're trying so hard to change it because you heard you should change it, that you end up throwing around some certain terms and phrases that you don't really realize are actually might be counterproductive.
So let's talk about specific senior roles. So commanding officer, CEO, how do we talk about people in management?
Yeah, and this is one of the first things that I see a lot is people will say, excuse me, they will say they want to look like that they're talking to the big wig, so they say I reported directly to the CEO. Well, there really isn't a CEO in the military unless you're going to go to the President of the United States. So if just because you're talking to the commanding officer of a battalion, well, that battalion officer's he or she has a boss, and that boss has got a boss. And just when you think that you're the big fish in this pond, for example, at a battalion level or a regimental level, well, maybe you got promoted and now you're working at the Pentagon and you realize that the person that you thought was a big wig is not really a big wig. CEOs at a company are responsible for everything the company does. No one else gives them guidance or advice outside of maybe a board of directors. But it's not something where they have someone who they can never say, well, this is policy from above. So if your boss has to implement policy from above, especially if there's a long chain of that policy, then you're not talking about the CEO, the chief executive officer. So when you mix those terms up, it kind of shows that you may not really understand the business world.
So what should someone do instead of saying, I reported to the CEO or I supported the CEO? Would, director, vice president, what should they do?
Yeah, and I think the best way to do this is when you're on your resume, for example, or even when you're talking to people, to basically to tell the story, to basically, first of all, describe the organization or level of organization that you were in. If you were at a battalion level, or if you were on a ship, a big ship, a small ship, a squadron level in the Air Force, whatever, describe the fact that you were in an organization that was this big, that had this many people, and that, but also not just saying that you gave advice to the CEO or you were handpicked by the CEO, but really go back to focusing on the specific skills and programs that you were responsible for. That you were the local subject matter expert on this policy or on this piece of equipment or on this type of of an operational area. But you're almost better off just telling the story. I mean, just explain it, because if you try to take the shortcut of saying, well, I did it to the CEO, it's almost like you're, either A, they're going to think that you're puffing your chest out more than you should, B, they're going to think you don't understand the business world, or maybe C, they might think both, and none of those things are good.
And so you were actually using a word or using a term that we wanted to touch on a little bit more, responsible for.
Yeah.
So how do we better explain responsible for when we're moving from a military resume into a civilian resume?
Yeah, and this kind of ties into our previous webinar where we talked about not using your resume is not your fit rep, because in your fitness reports in the military, you're always going to say, well, I was responsible for this program or responsible for that program. Just remember that that's a descriptive phase. It describes the job that you were asked to do, but as soon as you left that job, somebody else was responsible for those same programs or those same people. So it doesn't really differentiate you. So you might want to say that in your position, if you want to describe the position, to say that you're responsible for it, that's fine. I'm not saying not to describe it. Just know that that's not a verb. You need to follow that up with, what did you do in those positions? What kind of whether it's policies, whether it's kind of programs that you implemented, whether it was training that you provided, or whatever it is that you did. Just know that you can't just lean on being responsible for. And I think a lot of veterans do that because they want to say, usually when they say responsible for, they think that the impact statement is the big program that they're going to list after that. And they think that someone's, oh my goodness, she was responsible for the whole entire medical department. Well, that doesn't say if she was good or bad. So you make sure you follow that up and list it with things. So don't lean on responsible for.
Sounds great. Another is understanding sort of the business terms that a
Mm-hmm.
lot of, we know that when we talk to a lot of people in the military, it's inherent in many of their roles and responsibilities to manage a budget, to oversee workforce. But how does that necessarily translate into the corporate civilian world? Because
Yeah.
yes, there's managing budgets, but people are also meant to make profits in the
Yeah.
civilian world.
So there's nothing wrong with managing a budget. So when I talk about this, I'm not saying that you should discount the fact that you managed a budget. I think what we want to just point out is that there's a difference between managing a budget and in the military, and what you do in the private sector. Even if you're in a government contracting position, that government contractor, if it doesn't make money, it doesn't exist. I mean, you got to remember that in the military and the government spaces, we're kind of designed to lose money. They say that the job is so important that if we have to, you know, and so think about the differences of those things. And if you're in the military and you're managing a budget, we've all been there. Sometimes it's like, you can't buy anything now, you can't spend anything now, you can't do this. And then all of a sudden it's the end of the fiscal year and they say, buy everything, spend all your budget, make sure that you spend every dime or you won't get any more money next year. That's if private sector folks operated the way the government does, they would all go under. And usually everybody agrees with that statement. So once you agree with that, you say, well, okay, now I can't just rely on saying that I managed a budget, and that therefore you should put me in charge of this position that requires, to make a profit, whether it's a departmental profit or a company profit. One of the stories that I remember when I first, this being my first job coming out of the military, and I remember when I realized, because I was in a sales role, and when it was so nice when I said I generated more revenue than the company gave me for that month, and I thought to myself, okay, I'm doing okay. I had never thought like that when I was in the military and said, what did I do to generate revenue for the company to keep it going? So especially if you're gonna be put in a position of management, if you can't tell that story, then then a you know then maybe you're not going to get the job. But if you can't tell the story, then what that might mean is that might be a reason why you don't start as high up the ladder as you think. You might say, well, I have these management skills, and they might say, well, we want you to start at a smaller level to work your way up. Those are the types of skills that we just don't get in the military. So you're going to have to get them somehow, some way. And a lot of times they're going to want to see those types of things before they're going to trust you with a big time leadership role in a department.
And when we're talking about managing a budget, I think we need to go into some of the key components with this, because managing a budget in the civilian world is very different than managing a budget within the military world. I understand that it's more about managing the workforce, managing, programs, it seems to be a lot more detailed. And the one thing that I notice a lot when I look at military resumes or I speak to veterans is that they say manage budget, but there is a lot more to managing a budget within the
Hmm.
military. What are some of the things you would recommend a veteran tease out of managing a budget to delineate specifically all the different roles and responsibilities they had with that?
Yeah, so that's a great way to ask the question, because you have to look at it in that manner, just like you're saying, Kathleen. Instead of thinking that on your resume, managed a budget of some giant number is what's going to impress people, you're actually better off getting a little bit more granular, like you say, and say, well, not only was I asked to manage a budget, throughout the quarter, but if you were doing, if it was if you were in a recruiting position, I know I did recruiting my last 3 years, and they might get a quarterly budget or an annual budget for marketing. When you say, well, I had to make decisions about this particular slice of the budget, to say yes or to say no to things, that you identified specific discrepancies, or that you identified cost overruns, things like that, where you can say that you kind of saved the money, or if you happen to have found a different way to allocate the money. You had the same amount of money, but you shifted it. So in this way, it really kind of ties back to our previous point of responsible for. It's so easy for people to say, I was responsible for a $25 million budget, or the other one they do is responsible for $25 million worth of people and equipment, because in the military, for your fit reps, going back to our last webinar, those big numbers are what kind of drive how successful you were. But they don't talk about what the decisions that you made. So when it comes to your budgeting, you want to show what kind of decisions you had to make, because that can show, for a company that's looking at profit and loss, say, well, what did this person do when they had to make a critical decision? What was the thought process behind shifting funds from this to that to the other, as opposed to just spending, spending, spending.
Sounds great. Another thing that I'm always, amazed at is that when someone says, well, yes, I was responsible for a battalion, or I was responsible for, a platoon, what that doesn't translate well into the civilian world is what kind of leadership skills
Hmm.
that takes,
Yeah.
and what kind of workforce management that takes. So can you talk a little bit about how people should talk about their leadership roles or their management roles?
Yeah, and I see this a whole lot, of folks coming out, especially the more senior folks, but even the mid senior. Even I'm not saying you got to be like an E8, or that you've got to be like an O5 to say this. Sometimes you see the more mid level folks trying to say, well, I led and managed these people and I accomplished this goal. Sounds great. I was a great leader. I was chief petty officer in the Navy, so I saw this as part of my job. But one of the things that you don't have, well, first of all, the differences in the private sector and the military is, you know, in the military, people can't just quit. I mean, they might quit on you, but they can't just quit. If they don't show up to work, you can literally put them in jail. And in the civilian sector, the way you treat people, you know, they can just leave. They can choose to leave at any given time. So that's something that's different. When you don't have I say the UCMJ to kind of back you up, you can't just force people to be there. But the other thing is, and this is a little bit more of a nuanced thing, you also can't just let people go either. In the military, we were famous for, I treat my people right. Hey, these guys worked hard Monday through Thursday. I just want to give them Friday off. So come in for a formation and go home. Well, if all the people that you're working for are getting paid by the hour, and they're not there to work and they're not getting paid, that you're giving them time off, if it doesn't mean pay, that's not good for them. In the military, you can do that, because whether you give them a Friday off or whether you make them work on Saturday, they're making the same amount of money. And so those decisions that you have to make about how you're going to treat people can be different. And then I haven't even touched on things like wage and hour laws that say, you can't keep somebody legally after so many hours, or you've got to pay them time and a half. So those are pieces that just in the military, you just don't have to deal with. I'm not saying that somebody can't figure those things out. I'm just saying that if you lean into that and act like it's not a big deal, you end up showing your ignorance of things, and people will say, well, I wonder, could you really do it? Or are you going to be that person that just says, well, no, I'll just get here and I'll make it happen. Come hell or high water, I'm going to make it happen. And that doesn't always work.
That sounds great. So do you want to go through the 2 or 3 tips just sort of as a summary of what we talked about today?
Yeah, if I had to really put this all into one big capsule, I would say the things about this are, if you learn anything from this little webinar, it's identifying things that we just don't necessarily know about. We just haven't been exposed to. There's nothing we talked about here that can't be overcome, but the sooner that you can just understand that these things exist, then you can position yourself. All of this stuff can be, can be overcome, or it can just be avoided the way you talk about things. But the biggest piece is getting out of your bubble, and whether that's following, how can you get out of your bubble? Like following industry things, industry organizations, whatever industry you happen to be in. This is the value of some off-duty education, taking some basic business classes, following specific, business type leadership podcasts that are focused on the business world as opposed to the military. You'll see that a lot of the concepts might be the same, but the terms are very different. And as long as you know those things, you won't step in it by using the wrong term at the wrong time, because that just highlights that you may not be really ready for prime time when it comes to the private sector.
That sounds great. Bob, thanks so much for your tips on how to make sure that we are speaking in civilian terms rather than military terms. Thank you so much for being part of ClearedJobs.Net. Bob, you have a great day.